Raylan had never been the type to step into a high-energy club with pounding bass and glittering lights. Her life revolved around routine, long shifts at the bookstore, quiet evenings reading her favorite novels, and a small studio apartment where she felt safe. But that particular night felt different. Her best friend had insisted she try something new, venture outside her comfort zone, and let her hair down for once. So she found herself in the neon-lit chaos of a place called Moonlight Lounge. At first, Raylan felt completely out of her element. She stood by the bar, clutching a glass of soda water and stealing glances at the mesmerizing rainbow of lights that spilled across the dance floor. The music roared so loudly she could feel it reverberating in her chest. She thought about leaving the second she arrived. This just wasn't her scene. Then, at the edge of the bar, she noticed a tall, composed figure whose mere presence made everyone else in the room seem to fade. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that accentuated his broad shoulders, his dark hair perfectly styled. He looked utterly collected in an environment where everyone else was either dancing frenetically or shouting just to be heard. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. It happened so quickly that Raylan almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But when she turned away, her cheeks suddenly warm, she felt an unmistakable pull in her chest, as if something compelling was urging her to look back. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, and there he was again, still watching her, his expression calm yet piercing. She couldn't help noticing the depth in his eyes, which hinted at secrets she couldn't begin to guess. He introduced himself as Zafe Howell in a voice that was surprisingly gentle against the night's cacophony. The next thing Raylan knew, they were talking, words flowing as if they had known each other far longer than a few minutes. She wondered if it was the hypnotic swirl of the neon lights, or maybe the fleeting sense of freedom she felt after deciding to do something different with her life. Whatever it was, she found herself talking to him about everything. She spoke of her quiet ambitions, her love for old books, even her uncertainty about what she wanted for her future. He listened in a way that made her feel important, valued, as though each word she said deserved its own space in the universe. Zafe, in turn, revealed small glimpses of his world. He was the heir to a massive business empire, though he rarely made public appearances. He had stepped into the club that night more out of restless curiosity than actual desire for a loud party scene. While he refrained from detailing the scope of his wealth, Raylan could sense there was far more to him than met the eye. Yet he didn't flaunt his status, he seemed genuinely curious about her, the ordinary girl who found herself standing next to him, nursing a simple soda water instead of a fancy cocktail. As the conversation flowed, Raylan felt her guard slipping away. There was something in Zafe's attentive demeanor, the way he leaned in closer to hear her over the noise, that made her heart pound. She couldn't remember the last time she felt so alive, so unexpectedly drawn to someone. The heat in the air thickened, and the music felt like it was pulsing through every cell in her body. At one point, Zafe asked if she wanted to step outside for some fresh air. She agreed instantly, grateful for an excuse to escape the crush of bodies on the dance floor. Moonlight Lounge sat near a small veranda that overlooked the city skyline. The air out there was brisk, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the soft glow of streetlights far below. Leaning against the railing, Raylan took a deep breath and closed her eyes, her head still buzzing from the relentless beat of the club. When she opened them, Zafe was standing beside her, jacket draped over one arm, his gaze steady on her face. Despite the late hour, they kept talking in hushed tones, oblivious to the other patrons stepping out for a smoke or a quick breather. Raylan found herself laughing at his wry jokes about corporate life and the eccentricities of boardroom politics. He teased her about her fascination with old, dusty books, asking how someone so charming and bright could hide away in a bookstore all day. The way he said it wasn't insulting, though, it felt more like a gentle nudge, a fascination with the quiet world she inhabited. Eventually, even the veranda grew too crowded with people seeking the same calm. Their conversation felt too intimate for curious eyes and ears. Zafe asked if she wanted to find somewhere quieter, just to talk, he clarified. There was no pressure in his voice, but an undeniable undercurrent of attraction crackled between them. Raylan hesitated only a moment. Something about Zaif made her trust him, a sense that he wasn't out to manipulate or hurt her. She nodded, and they left the club, weaving through the throng of dancers and stepping out into the stillness of the city streets. They wandered under the glow of street lamps, passing shuttered storefronts and silent intersections. The world felt deserted except for the two of them. Zaif found a tiny all-night cafe where they sank into a corner booth and ordered coffee. Time lost all meaning in that shared space. Their conversation soared and dipped through personal anecdotes, silly childhood memories, earnest hopes for the future, and confessions of lingering fears. Raylan marveled at how open she felt. She was sharing thoughts she never spoke aloud, not even to her closest friends. When they finally emerged from the cafe, the sky was tinted with the first pale streaks of dawn. Raylan's pulse fluttered as Zaif took her hand, and neither questioned the warmth that surged through their intertwined fingers. Without words, they understood something was happening between them, a potent, immediate connection that demanded they live in the moment. He hailed a taxi, and rather than saying separate goodbyes, they ended up at his penthouse suite. Under normal circumstances, Raylan would have paused. She wasn't the kind of woman to follow a near stranger home. But her heart told her to go. She sensed that this fleeting chance might never come again, and something in Zaif's solemn gaze reassured her in ways logic never could. Inside his penthouse, the city lights stretched below them like an endless glittering sea. The quiet hush of the luxurious space contrasted sharply with the pounding club and the bustle of the street. Raylan felt the adrenaline of the night buzzing through her veins. She looked at Zaif and realized just how deeply she wanted the sense of belonging she saw in his eyes. It was as if a door to a new world had flung open in a single evening. The rational part of her mind urged caution, but the desire in her heart drowned out all warnings. Hours later, the sun rose high enough to spill soft morning light through the penthouse windows. Neither of them had slept. They'd talked and shared fleeting embraces, kisses that spoke of promise and longing. When Raylan finally drifted into a brief, dreamless sleep, her head on Zaif's chest, she felt a security she didn't know she was missing. Yet as comforting as it was, neither could foresee the magnitude of the events this single night would set into motion. What they had shared was more than just a chance encounter, it was the spark of something that would upend both their lives in ways neither had dared to imagine. Raylan returned to her small studio apartment feeling like she had lived a dream she couldn't quite name. In the days after that night with Zaif, every ordinary thing, her familiar bookshelf stuffed with second-hand novels, the faint hum of the heating vents, the squeak of the old floorboards, seemed transformed by the memory of those charged hours. She often found herself staring at her phone, recalling his voice as he murmured her name in the pre-dawn hush. A hint of embarrassment tinged her reflections. Normally she was so careful, so contained, yet she had followed him without hesitation. The intensity of what they shared overshadowed all her usual caution, and as the days passed, she found herself torn between a giddy longing to see him again and an unsettling fear that she had been foolish to open her heart so quickly. At first, she waited for Zaif to call or text, telling herself that a man with his responsibilities might be juggling countless obligations. Each beep of her phone made her pulse leap. She even found excuses to keep her ringer on high, so she wouldn't miss a single message. But as 2 weeks drifted by and then a third, anxiety began to coil in her stomach. Could it be that their connection had been a fleeting spark that only felt monumental in the hazy glow of late-night adventure? She tried to push away the pang of disappointment by focusing on her bookstore work. She stayed extra hours, reorganizing shelves, chatting with regular customers, anything to distract her from the gnawing silence of her phone. It was near the end of the third week when Raylan sensed something was off with her body. Fatigue weighed her down, and simple tasks like walking a few blocks left her breathless. Then came the early morning nausea, mild at first, but persistent enough to raise her suspicions. She brushed it aside, maybe it was stress, maybe the lingering after-effects of that sleepless night. Yet a growing worry whispered at the back of her mind, she was never this exhausted, nor had her appetite changed so drastically. Finally, in the dim light of her cramped bathroom, she steeled her nerves and took a pregnancy test. When the pink lines formed before her eyes, she felt her chest tighten so hard she thought she might faint. She convinced herself it could be a false positive and took another, and another. Each one yielded the same answer. She was pregnant. A wave of shock washed over her. She sank onto the edge of the bathtub, heart hammering. This was not part of her plan. She didn't even have a clear sense of what her next month would look like, let alone motherhood. She managed to call a nearby clinic and schedule an appointment to confirm everything, her voice trembling as she tried to sound calm. A few days later, the doctor's gentle words echoed in her mind, "You're expecting quintuplets." That single sentence turned her world upside down. She could barely process the word pregnant before having to grapple with the reality of five tiny lives growing inside her. Her eyes prickled with tears in the doctor's office, a mixture of terror and awe swirling in her mind. How would she care for 5 babies on her meager bookstore salary? Where would she live? And how in the world was she supposed to share this colossal news with Zaif, the mysterious heir she hadn't heard from since that life-altering night? In the days that followed, Raylan existed in a dreamlike state. The clinic supplied her with pamphlets on high-risk pregnancies and scheduled further checkups to monitor her condition. Every new piece of medical advice, take extra vitamins, avoid stress, rest more, felt like bricks stacking on her shoulders. She realized she couldn't delay much longer. Zaif deserved to know, and no matter how terrified she was of his reaction, it wouldn't be fair to hide something so monumental from him. Gathering her courage, she dialed the number he had scribbled on a cafe napkin for her that night. The line rang, echoing in her silent studio, then went to voicemail. She tried again the next day with the same result. A creeping dread formed in the pit of her stomach. Had he changed his number, or was he intentionally not picking up? Could he have predicted what she was going to say? Then, late one afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled up outside her building. Raylan pressed her face to the window, confusion knotting her brow. Nobody in her neighborhood drove a car that expensive. It was only when a sharply dressed woman stepped out and made her way to the front door that Raylan felt an electric jolt of anxiety. She watched the woman check the apartment numbers, speak briefly to her landlord, then nod curtly before climbing the stairs. A brisk knock sounded at Raylan's door. Heart pounding, she opened it. The woman introduced herself as Henrietta Hastings, a personal assistant to Zaif Howell, speaking in a clipped, efficient tone. She explained that Mr. Howell wished to speak with Raylan and had gone to considerable lengths to find her after she seemed to vanish. Before Raylan could gather her thoughts, Henrietta offered a politely forced smile and extended a card. "We can leave immediately, if you're ready," she said. Raylan's mind spun. Part of her wanted to resist, to ask how in the world Zaif had tracked her down, or why she hadn't heard from him personally. But the worry in Henrietta's gaze suggested urgency. Perhaps there was more to this story than Raylan realized. And some fragile seed of hope bloomed in her chest. If Zaif had gone to such lengths to find her, maybe he wouldn't reject the news of her pregnancy after all. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she feared. Pressing a hand to her still flat belly, she nodded, slipped on her coat, and followed Henrietta down the stairs. As she settled into the plush leather seat of the SUV, her mind raced with questions. Did Zaif already suspect? Was he hurt that she hadn't contacted him sooner, or was he oblivious to the life-altering secret she carried? Raylan gazed at the city blurred by the tinted windows. She thought of the moment she first looked into his eyes under the neon lights, feeling an inexplicable certainty that her life would never be the same. Now, with 5 unborn children filling her future, she was on the verge of a confrontation that could either bring her relief or heartbreak. She had no idea what waited behind the gates of whatever estate they were driving toward, but she clung to a single thought: Zaif had found her. That had to mean something. The fear and hope in her heart intertwined so tightly that she could hardly tell where one ended and the other began. The ride through the city felt strangely quiet, despite the low hum of the luxury SUV's engine. Raylan sat in the back seat, her eyes glued to the changing scenery outside. The buildings grew sparser, and soon they were passing through a more affluent district of wide streets and ornate gates. She clutched her purse with clammy hands, her heart pounding with a confusing blend of hope and dread. Just a few days earlier, she had been preparing to leave a voicemail for Zaif, practicing the exact words to explain what had happened and why she had never contacted him after that one unforgettable night. Now, it seemed that he'd taken matters into his own hands. Henrietta Hastings sat across from her, occasionally tapping on a tablet but speaking very little. The woman's polished composure only amplified Raylan's anxiety. Would Zaif be angry with her? Would he believe she had deliberately avoided him? Or worse, would he suspect her motives? A tangle of unanswered questions tightened in her chest the closer they got to his estate. Eventually, the SUV slowed before a high, wrought iron gate. Security cameras perched like silent sentinels on either side, tracking their approach. Raylan peered through the tinted window at an enormous wall that stretched out of sight, suggesting a vast property behind it. She caught her reflection in the glass, wide eyes, paler than usual complexion, and a faint tremble in her lips that she struggled to still. On the other side of the gate, a long driveway curved up toward what looked like a mansion pulled straight out of a fairy tale. The estate's design fused modern architecture with traditional, grand columns and expansive lawns. The SUV rumbled past manicured hedges and carefully tended flower beds, until it drew to a smooth stop in front of the stately entrance. Henrietta exited first, moving briskly to open Raylan's door. "Mr. Howell is waiting inside," she said, her tone polite but distant. Raylan stepped onto the immaculate gravel, gazing up at the mansion's towering facade. For a moment, she felt as though she were standing in someone else's life. A distant memory of that neon-lit night at Moonlight Lounge flitted through her mind, reminding her that Zaif, despite all his wealth, had seemed so genuine, so approachable in that solitary corner of the bar. Feeling a new surge of determination, she lifted her chin and followed Henrietta across the polished marble steps. Inside, the foyer rose with cathedral-like ceilings, marble floors reflecting glimmers of the midday sun that spilled through tall windows. A quiet hush lingered in the corridors, broken only by the soft click of Henrietta's heels. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency in the background, their eyes respectfully lowered as Raylan passed. She was led to a spacious sitting room where a sweeping view of the gardens played out behind towering glass panels. Sunlight lit the space in a delicate glow, illuminating a cluster of plush chairs arranged around a low table. There, standing with one hand resting on the back of a chair, was Zaif. He wore a tailored charcoal suit jacket over a crisp shirt left slightly unbuttoned at the collar, his dark hair as impeccably styled as on the night they met. Yet the moment he saw Raylan step into the room, his posture eased. A flicker of relief touched his features, followed by an intensity that made her catch her breath. Henrietta discreetly bowed her head and retreated, leaving them alone. For a moment, neither spoke. Raylan noticed how his eyes swept over her, as if trying to confirm she was truly there, and maybe to check if she was all right. She steeled her resolve and willed herself not to look away. Finally, he broke the silence. "I've been searching for you," Zaif said quietly. His voice had that same steady warmth she remembered, yet she picked up on an undertone of emotion he was fighting to contain. "I called the bookstore, but I was told you quit. I checked your old apartment, but you'd already moved." He paused, searching her expression. "I was worried." Raylan's mouth went dry. She hadn't expected worry. Resentment, perhaps, or accusations of abandonment, but genuine concern made her feel guilt coil inside her. She drew in a deep breath, feeling her pulse skip when she met his gaze. There's so much I need to tell you," she confessed. "I thought you never tried to reach me. I kept expecting a call, a text, anything. But it never came." She realized her tone had sharpened with pent-up frustration, so she forced herself to speak more calmly. A few weeks ago, I decided I had to tell you something important. But I couldn't get through to you. A small line etched itself between Zaf's brows. I changed my number after a security breach at my office. I had no idea you were trying to contact me. By the time I realized you'd vanished, your landlord said you left the building, and your coworkers at the bookstore mentioned you'd resigned. He paused, lips forming a faint, almost regretful curve. I started to think you didn't want to be found. Before she could respond, Zaf gestured for Raylan to sit in one of the plush chairs. She settled tentatively, smoothing her palms over her skirt to hide their trembling. The entire situation felt surreal. Here she was, in a sumptuous room more opulent than any place she'd been, about to drop the bombshell news of not just one baby, but 5. Anticipation buzzed in the room, thick as static. Zaf watched her in silence for a moment. Then he took a seat across from her, close enough that she could catch a subtle hint of his cologne. "What is it you needed to tell me?" he asked, voice soft yet urgent. "Henrietta mentioned you seemed troubled." An instinctive urge to protect herself flared up in Raylan's mind. This could change everything. Once he knew the truth, there was no going back. She looked down at her hands, noticing the slight tremor in her fingers, and then forced herself to meet Zaf's gaze. "I'm pregnant," she said, voice barely above a whisper. The words themselves felt momentous, like a door slamming shut on the life she had known. With quintuplets. His reaction was not what she expected. For a heartbeat, shock flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something deeper, surprise, and perhaps even a flash of wonder. He leaned forward as if drawn by an invisible force, searching her face. 5, he said, tone hushed. Raylan bit her lip and nodded, feeling both vulnerable and oddly relieved now that the truth was out. Seconds stretched, thick with possibility. Suddenly, Zaf's expression set, and he reached across the small gap between them, gently taking one of her hands in his. His touch was warm, steadying. "This isn't something you should have to face alone," he murmured. "I wish you'd been able to reach me sooner." His gaze flickered to her flat belly, then back to her face. "No matter what else happens, I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. You and our children." The wave of relief that flooded Raylan's chest brought tears to her eyes. She breathed out a quivering sigh she hadn't realized she was holding. 1,000 questions still weighed on her mind: how they would handle this huge responsibility, what it meant for her future, for his, for them together. Yet in that moment, she clung to his unexpected reassurance, the spark of resolve in his eyes. Whatever complications lay ahead, they would no longer be hers to bear alone. Outside the window, a breeze stirred the neatly trimmed hedges, sunlight spilling across the emerald lawns. The hush of the estate enveloped them, cradling that fragile moment of shared reality. Raylan let out a shaky breath and nodded, meeting Zaf's gaze with a mix of trepidation and hope. They had countless challenges ahead: his demanding life, her uncertainty, and the sheer enormity of bringing 5 new souls into the world. But for now, at least, she wasn't alone in this. And for the first time since she saw those twin lines on the pregnancy test, she allowed herself a flicker of cautious optimism. Raylan was still reeling from Zaf's reaction, part relief, part astonishment, and an undeniable undercurrent of determination, when a discreet knock sounded at the door. She and Zaf exchanged a glance, and she felt his hand tighten over hers in a quick, reassuring squeeze before he called out for the visitor to enter. Henrietta stepped in, her posture rigid as always, and cleared her throat. "Mr. Howell," she began, flicking her gaze only briefly toward Raylan. "Your sister has arrived. Shall I show her in?" Raylan sensed an immediate shift in Zaf's demeanor. The warm light she'd seen in his expression only moments earlier chilled, replaced by an alert wariness she couldn't quite decipher. Even his posture straightened, as though preparing for a confrontation. He looked at Raylan, his gaze briefly apologetic, then nodded to Henrietta. "Yes, please. Tell her we'll meet her in the drawing room." Henrietta dipped her head and left with the same efficient composure she'd brought into the room. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Zaif exhaled slowly, releasing Raylan's hand. His jaw tensed. "My sister, Aurelia," he explained, rubbing a hand along the back of his neck. "She's, well, not the easiest person to deal with. But she's family." Raylan noted the weariness in his voice. She recalled how he'd mentioned a complicated family dynamic the night they met but had never elaborated. "Will she be upset about this?" she asked quietly, gesturing with one hand to encompass the news of the pregnancy, the enormity of everything. Zaif's brows creased. "Likely. But what matters is how we handle it. I stand by what I said, you don't have to face any of this alone." His words rekindled the flicker of warmth in her chest. Nodding, she stood, and together they followed Henrietta's path through a set of tall double doors that led into an even grander chamber. The drawing room was awash in soft daylight, with enormous windows overlooking a sculpted rose garden. Ornate paintings lined the walls, and two crystal chandeliers glimmered overhead. At the center of the room, a woman with sleek black hair and impeccably tailored attire stood with her back to them, arms folded as she studied one of the paintings. Even from behind, Raylan could sense her poise and the unwavering confidence that seemed to radiate off her. When Aurelia turned around, her dark eyes immediately settled on Raylan. A polite, though somewhat forced, smile tugged at her lips, a gesture that failed to mask the cool curiosity behind her gaze. "Zaif," she said, inclining her head toward her brother. "I was surprised to hear you summon me so urgently. Is everything all right?" Zaif positioned himself beside Raylan in a subtle but telling show of solidarity. "I'm fine," he replied. "I asked you to come because there's important news to discuss." Aurelia's eyes lingered on Raylan as though attempting to decipher her significance. She offered a perfunctory greeting. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Raylan," Zaif said, inclining his head in her direction. "My fiancé." Raylan felt her heart skip at that particular choice of introduction, though neither she nor Zaif had uttered that word, fiancé, until now. Whether he'd chosen it to simplify matters or to protect her from Aurelia's prying, she couldn't be sure. Yet hearing it spoken aloud stirred an odd sense of relief, as if he had just drawn a protective circle around her in front of his family. Aurelia's expression revealed nothing but a momentary flash of recognition that this was more than a casual acquaintance. She crossed the room, her steps measured, until she stood close enough for Raylan to catch a faint scent of designer perfume. "Raylan," Aurelia echoed, pressing her lips into a polite line. "Lovely to meet you. May I ask how you and my brother met?" The question could have been innocent, but something in Aurelia's carefully modulated tone set Raylan on edge. She forced a friendly, if slightly nervous, smile. "We ran into each other a few weeks ago," she said, carefully omitting mention of the club or the immediate spark that led to that fateful night. "It was unexpected." Zaif stepped in smoothly. "We've decided to move forward together. Raylan will be staying here at the estate. I want to ensure she's well cared for." He cast a brief glance at his sister, as though daring her to challenge his decision. Aurelia's brows arched a fraction, and a spark of unease flickered across her poised features. "I see," she said. "You make it sound quite serious." "It is," Zaif answered, a note of steel in his voice. "Raylan's pregnant, with quintuplets." Had Raylan not been the one carrying the news, she might have laughed at how plainly Zaif dropped the bombshell. But in the hush of the stately drawing room, his words reverberated with an echo of finality, as though leaving no room for debate. Aurelia's face remained unreadable for a heartbeat. Then her composure frayed around the edges, her eyes darted to Raylan's midsection, her lips parted as if to speak. For a moment, she said nothing, clearly grappling with a mixture of shock and, if Raylan read her expression correctly, suspicion. 5 children, Aurelia murmured at last. "That's remarkable." Her attention snapped back to Raylan, and this time, her voice was warmer, though still laced with an undeniable tension. "I trust you understand the significance of this, Miss Raylan, bringing 5 heirs into this family." She paused, then added with the faintest edge of condescension, "It's a rather large responsibility, in more ways than one." Raylan nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. "I do. It's overwhelming, to be honest, but I'm committed to doing what's best for the babies." Aurelia listened, then turned to Zaif. "I hope you understand, dear brother, how this changes everything. Our father's estate, the board's expectations, the future of Howell Enterprises, news of quintuplets won't remain a private matter for long." She paced gracefully across the room, her high heels tapping over polished floors. "Have you even consulted the legal team yet? Or the shareholders? The press?" Zaif's expression hardened. "My first priority is Raylan and the children. There will be time for the rest. I want them safe, cared for, and shielded from any unwelcome scrutiny until we're ready to make an announcement." Aurelia paused by the grand window, her back turned to them as she gazed out at the estate grounds. When she finally spoke, her tone softened, but Raylan caught a hint of resignation. "Very well," she said. "I trust your judgment, Zaif, but be careful. The path ahead isn't going to be easy." Her gaze flicked meaningfully to Raylan. "I hope you're prepared for the reality of our family, Miss Raylan. The Howell name demands certain sacrifices." Though Aurelia's words were outwardly polite, Raylan felt the chill beneath them. She sensed a warning as clear as if Aurelia had spoken it outright: "This family has claws, and if you're not strong enough, you'll find yourself wounded." But Raylan squared her shoulders and nodded politely. "I understand," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. A brief silence followed before Aurelia pivoted away from the window. "I'll leave you two to handle the details," she said, her posture impeccable, every movement a deliberate statement of elegance. "And Raylan, welcome to the family." With that, she swept out of the room, the echo of her heels fading down the corridor. When the door finally closed, Raylan slumped slightly with relief. She looked up to see Zaif studying her, a faint line between his brows. "I'm sorry," he said softly, taking a few steps closer. "My sister can be intense. She's used to wielding a lot of influence here. She and I share ownership of Howell Enterprises, so she feels personally invested in every major life decision I make." Raylan mustered a small smile. "I get it. She's worried about how this will affect the family. I can't blame her, honestly. It's a lot." He reached for her hand again, warmth spreading through her from the gentle pressure of his fingers. "I promise I won't let her, or anyone, make you feel unwelcome." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he glanced around the grand drawing room. "You're carrying 5 heirs to the Howell name. You belong here just as much as I do." She felt emotion welling up, part gratitude, part lingering fear. It struck her how quickly her world had shifted. Only weeks earlier, she was shelving books and sipping instant coffee in her humble studio. Now, she was here in this vast estate, sharing an almost unimaginable future with a man she barely knew but felt inexplicably drawn to. A tremor coursed through her at the enormity of it all. Zaif must have sensed her inner turmoil because he guided her toward one of the ornate sofas. They sat, and he angled himself to face her directly. "We'll take this one step at a time," he said, his voice resolute yet gentle. "The estate is a lot to adjust to, especially for someone who's not used to constant staff around. If you feel overwhelmed or need space, just say the word. I can arrange a quieter set of rooms in a different wing, or we can limit who has access." Raylan's mouth twisted into a rueful half-smile. "It's all overwhelming. I'm not exactly cut out for high society living. But I'll manage." He nodded, brushing a strand of hair away from her cheek. The subtle intimacy of that gesture ignited a flicker of warmth in her chest. "You won't have to deal with it alone, Raylan," he repeated, emphasizing each word. "I promise." They fell quiet then, surrounded by the silent testimony of the Howell family's wealth, polished antiques, masterful artwork, and expansive windows displaying gardens that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Raylan wondered how she would ever adapt to a life where every step echoed through marble halls and every move attracted curious eyes. Still, within the hush of that grand space, she felt something else, a tentative hope. Yes, Aurelia's guarded hostility loomed, and countless questions hung in the air about how the world would react to this shocking news of quintuplets. But Zaf's unwavering presence beside her was undeniable. The look in his eyes, equal parts determination and compassion, told her he meant every word of his vow. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future, not just for herself but for the 5 unborn children nestled safely beneath her heart, a future in which they might be part of something bigger than any life she had envisioned for herself. With each breath, she felt the weight of both fear and possibility press down on her. And in the stillness, she dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the foundation they were building, however precarious, could be strong enough to carry them into the unknown days ahead. The days following the confrontation with Aurelia were a whirlwind of adjustments and unspoken promises. Zaf's insistence that she settle into one of the quieter wings of the estate grew more urgent as his concern for her health, and that of the unborn quintuplets, became undeniable. Though Raylan had hesitated at first, the persistent advice from doctors and the sheer exhaustion of trying to fend for herself in a world so far removed from the comforts of this opulent environment left her with little choice. Slowly, she began to embrace the strange rhythm of life within the vast, guarded corridors of the estate, even as every marble surface and antique whisper reminded her that she was no longer living in her modest past. In the early hours of a particularly cool morning, Raylan awoke to the gentle chime of an unseen clock and the soft glow of dawn filtering through expansive windows. For a moment, she lay there, wrapped in a luxurious satin robe that smelled faintly of jasmine and old books, a scent that somehow evoked memories of both her previous life and this new chapter. As she blinked sleep from her eyes, she noticed something on the bedside table, a small velvet box resting atop a crisp, embroidered handkerchief. Next to it lay a delicate, handwritten note, its message both simple and charged with meaning: "Never say no to us, Raylan." Her heart pounded in a mixture of confusion and an unexpected thrill. The presence of the ring box, its dark, polished surface catching the morning light, hinted at a proposition that was as bold as it was sudden. Sitting up, Raylan turned the note over in her trembling fingers. The words seemed to echo in the quiet stillness of the room, reverberating with both promise and a silent demand. Her mind raced as she tried to recall the tenderness in Zaf's gaze from their last encounter, the unspoken vow in the way he had touched her hand. Everything had accelerated since that first night, a collision of passion, fear, and responsibility, and now, as she surveyed the elegant room that was slowly becoming her new world, she realized that her life was being irrevocably rewritten. Though part of her trembled at the speed of these changes, another part, one that had long yearned for something extraordinary, found solace in the certainty of Zaf's commitment. That day passed in a quiet, reflective haze. The estate buzzed with its usual understated efficiency, staff moved silently in polished shoes along corridors lined with portraits of stern ancestors, while servants adjusted the arrangements of fresh flowers and fine china with almost ritualistic care. Yet in the midst of this well-ordered luxury, Raylan felt a growing awareness of her own internal metamorphosis. Every time her gaze fell upon the velvet box on her bedside table, she was reminded of a promise that transcended the boundaries of class, circumstance, and even reason. She wondered what Zaf envisioned for them and the little ones who were now so much a part of her future. Although doubts lingered like shadows in the corners of her mind, a gentle warmth began to blossom there, a tentative belief that perhaps she was not as unprepared for this extraordinary life as she had feared. That evening, as the day surrendered to a soft, honeyed dusk, Zaf invited her to take a walk in the estate's sprawling gardens. The air was cool and balmy, scented with the perfume of blooming roses and the earthy aroma of freshly mown grass. The garden was alive with subtle music, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, the distant murmur of a fountain, and the delicate chorus of crickets awakening as twilight deepened. Underneath a canopy of ancient, graceful weeping willows, Zaif led her along a path that meandered through carefully arranged flower beds and manicured hedges. Raylan's steps were light, yet each footfall resonated with the gravity of her internal thoughts. The twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, and for a long while, the world seemed to pause in a moment of serene anticipation. Zaif's hand found hers naturally, and the simple warmth of his touch dispelled some of the lingering uncertainty. They walked in companionable silence, the space between them filled with unsaid words and shared hopes. As they approached a secluded nook beneath a particularly majestic willow, Zaif stopped and turned to face her. In that quiet haven, surrounded by the gentle murmur of nature, Zaif's eyes shone with an intensity that belied the calm of his exterior. He reached out, brushing a stray curl from her face as if to reassure her that she was safe in his presence. "Raylan," he began, his voice low and steady, "I know that everything is happening so fast. I understand if you're scared or uncertain, but there's something I need to say." He paused, drawing a deep breath as if gathering the strength to bridge the chasm between what had been and what could be. "I want to build a future with you, not just for us, but for our children. I want to be there for every first step, every laugh, every challenge that comes our way. I want to protect you, to cherish you, and to promise that you will never have to face life's storms alone." His words, spoken with unwavering conviction, stirred something deep within her. The cool night air, the gentle sway of the willow branches overhead, and the sincerity in his voice combined to create a moment that felt both timeless and transformative. Zaif slowly knelt on one knee, his movement deliberate and imbued with a solemnity that made the world around them seem to fade into insignificance. From the velvet box that had greeted her that morning, he produced a ring, a delicate, intricate band that caught the ambient light, refracting it into tiny specks of hope. "Raylan," he said, his tone tender yet resolute, "I know this journey has been unexpected, and I know that life has thrown challenges our way that neither of us could have foreseen. But I cannot imagine my life without you. I want to share every joy and every sorrow, every victory and every struggle. Will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Raylan's eyes welled with tears as she searched Zaif's face for a promise of an unbreakable bond. The world around them, once so full of daunting uncertainties, now glimmered with the possibility of a shared future. Her heart, which had been so burdened by fear and isolation, began to lighten with the realization that love could indeed be as profound as it was transformative. "Yes, Zaif," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion and certainty. "Yes, I will." In that luminous, fragile moment beneath the weeping willows, as the last vestiges of daylight surrendered to the night, their lives merged in a vow that transcended the chaos of fate. The gentle click of the ring as it settled upon her finger seemed to echo like a promise into the cool evening air, a promise that no matter how tumultuous the days ahead might be, they would face them together. As they embraced, the garden around them burst into a quiet symphony of nature's approval, each leaf and petal bearing silent witness to a new beginning born out of the most unexpected of proposals. The morning after the proposal, Raylan awoke with a strange sense of weightlessness, as though the reality of what had transpired the night before was too surreal to fully grasp. The engagement ring, delicate yet dazzling, rested snugly on her finger, its cool metal a tangible reminder that her world had irrevocably changed. As she lay beneath the luxurious covers of the estate's grand guest suite, she traced the band with her fingertips, marveling at the strange duality of emotions swelling in her chest, excitement and trepidation, anticipation and disbelief. She was engaged to Zaif Howell, a billionaire, the father of her unborn children. And soon, she would be part of a family so powerful and influential that her old life, with its quiet bookstore shelves and modest independence, felt like a distant dream. The quiet hum of the estate greeted her as she swung her legs over the bed, the morning light spilling through sheer drapes in golden beams. Somewhere outside, birds sang from the towering trees lining the estate's gardens, and the muffled sound of staff going about their duties carried through the hallways. The mansion was a world unto itself, timeless and untouchable, but today it felt different, like a world she was being invited to truly inhabit rather than merely visit. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door creaked open slightly, and Henrietta Hastings stepped inside, her expression as unreadable as ever. She carried a silver tray with a pot of tea, fresh fruit, and a selection of pastries that looked too perfect to eat. "Good morning, Miss Raylan," Henrietta greeted in her clipped, professional tone, setting the tray down on the small table near the window. "Mr. Howell has asked me to inform you that breakfast will be served in the main dining room. However, he understands if you prefer to eat here." Raylan swallowed, still adjusting to the formality of it all. "Thank you," she said softly, brushing a hand through her tousled hair. "I think I'll come downstairs." Henrietta nodded approvingly. "Very well. I'll have someone escort you in 20 minutes. As the door closed behind her, Raylan exhaled and reached for a cup of tea, savoring the warmth against her palms. She needed to be strong today. Strong enough to face the reality of what lay ahead, strong enough to stand beside Zaif not just as the mother of his children but as his fiancée, his future wife. 20 minutes later, she descended the grand staircase, her step steady despite the fluttering nerves in her stomach. The dining hall was just as magnificent as she remembered, with tall windows offering a view of the endless green estate beyond. Zaif was already seated at the long mahogany table, his dark eyes lifting to meet hers the moment she entered. The warmth in his gaze was immediate, softening the tension in her chest. "Good morning," he said, standing as she approached. "Good morning," she murmured, allowing him to pull out a chair for her. As she settled in, a member of the household staff poured her a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice before discreetly retreating. Zaif watched her closely, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Did you sleep well?" "I did," she admitted, sipping her juice. "Though I kept waking up to check if last night really happened." Zaif chuckled, his deep voice sending an unexplainable shiver down her spine. "I assure you, it did." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing over hers where they rested beside her plate. "And I don't plan on letting you change your mind." She looked down at their hands, at the contrast of his strong, tanned fingers against her slender, fair ones. "I'm not going to change my mind," she said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I'm just trying to process everything." Zaif nodded in understanding. "I don't expect you to adjust overnight, Raylan. But I do want you to feel safe here. This isn't just about the engagement or the babies. I want you to know that you belong." His words settled over her like a blanket of reassurance, soothing the worries that had been churning beneath the surface. She wanted to believe him, to believe that she truly had a place here, despite how overwhelming it all felt. Before she could respond, the dining room doors opened again, and a familiar presence stepped inside. Aurelia. Dressed in a sharp white blazer and perfectly pressed trousers, Zaif's sister moved with the calculated grace of someone who knew exactly how much power she wielded. Her dark eyes swept over the scene before her, lingering on the way Zaif's hand rested protectively over Raylan's before she let out a slow, measured breath. "I see you've wasted no time in making things official," she commented, her tone teetering between amusement and something colder. Zaif didn't flinch. There was no reason to wait. Aurelia took a seat across from them, folding her hands on the table with a practiced air of control. "Forgive me if I sound skeptical, but surely even you must see how unconventional this is." Raylan stiffened, but Zaif remained unfazed. "I see a future with the woman carrying my children. That's all that matters to me." Aurelia's gaze flicked to Raylan, sharp and assessing. "And you, Miss Raylan? Are you prepared for what it truly means to marry into this family? To be under the constant scrutiny of the media, the board, and high society? You won't just be Zaif's wife. You'll be a Howell. That comes with expectations." Raylan met her gaze head-on, summoning every ounce of courage within her. I know this won't be easy. But I'm not afraid of hard things. Aurelia studied her for a long moment before a small, almost imperceptible smirk touched her lips. Interesting, she murmured, before shifting her attention back to Zaif. I assume you've made arrangements to announce the engagement publicly. I'll handle it on my own terms, Zaif replied coolly. Aurelia arched a brow but didn't push further. Instead, she stood, smoothing an invisible crease in her blazer. Very well. I just hope you know what you're doing, brother. With a last, unreadable glance at Raylan, she turned on her heel and exited the room. The silence she left behind was thick with unspoken tension. Raylan let out a slow breath and turned to Zaif. She doesn't approve. She doesn't have to, Zaif said simply, squeezing her hand. She'll come around. But even if she doesn't, I don't care. What matters is us. The conviction in his voice steadied something inside her. Maybe Aurelia would always be skeptical, and maybe the world would always have its opinions. But as Zaif looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered, Raylan knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone in this. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. And for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. Raylan had expected the engagement to bring a measure of security, a sense that, no matter how overwhelming things became, she and Zaif were now tethered together by something stronger than circumstance. What she hadn't anticipated was just how quickly the outside world would intrude upon their fragile new reality. The first sign of trouble came just 2 days after Zaif had placed the engagement ring on her finger. She had been sitting in the sunroom, attempting to lose herself in one of the classic novels from the estate's expansive library, when Henrietta entered with her usual air of efficiency. But this time, there was something different about the way she carried herself, her movements just a fraction more tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. Raylan closed the book in her lap. Is something wrong? Henrietta hesitated before stepping closer. You should see this, she said simply, handing Raylan a sleek tablet. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, Raylan took it and looked at the screen. The headline blared at her in bold, unmistakable letters. Zaif Howell's shock engagement, unknown woman carries heir to the Howell fortune. Beneath it was a grainy photo, clearly taken without their knowledge, of her and Zaif walking through the gardens, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The article went on to speculate about who she was, where she had come from, and most damningly, whether she was nothing more than an opportunist who had trapped Zaif into marriage through an unexpected pregnancy. Her throat tightened. She skimmed through the article, each word sinking like a stone in her chest. They painted her as an unknown, a nobody. A bookstore clerk who had somehow ensnared a billionaire overnight. She felt a rush of nausea, but this time it had nothing to do with the pregnancy. The press caught wind of it fast, Henrietta murmured. It's already spreading across multiple media outlets. There are journalists stationed outside the estate's main gate, hoping for a statement. Raylan swallowed hard, placing the tablet down with more force than necessary. This is awful. Henrietta nodded, though she remained composed as always. Mr. Howell has already taken action. He's having our legal team work to control the narrative, but I thought you should be aware. He's currently in a meeting with his public relations advisors, discussing how to proceed. Raylan exhaled shakily. Does he want me to make a statement? Henrietta's gaze flickered, as though carefully choosing her words. For now, no. He wants to handle it himself. That, at least, was a relief. Raylan wasn't sure she could stomach standing in front of cameras, answering invasive questions about her relationship or her unborn children. Still, the knowledge that people were already twisting her story into something ugly made her chest ache. Henrietta hesitated, then added, "You may want to avoid social media. The comments are not kind." Raylan's stomach lurched at the implication. She had always known that public scrutiny came with Zaif's world, but facing it head-on felt like being thrown into deep waters without warning. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Henrietta nodded, then excused herself, leaving Raylan alone with the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. That evening, Zaif returned later than usual. The tension in his face was evident as he shrugged off his suit jacket and loosened his tie. He found her sitting in the drawing room, staring into the unlit fireplace. Without a word, he crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. It was an unexpected gesture, one that momentarily stole her breath. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her hair. Raylan closed her eyes, sinking into the warmth of him. "It's not your fault." Zaif pulled back just enough to look at her, his jaw tightening. "Yes, it is. This is my world, Raylan. And now it's yours too, whether you wanted it or not." She searched his gaze, seeing something beneath his frustration. Something like guilt. "Did the PR meeting go badly?" she asked. Zaif let out a low sigh and ran a hand through his hair. "The board wants damage control. They're worried about the company's reputation. They're pushing for us to hold a press conference, something official." Raylan stiffened. "A press conference? You mean, in front of cameras? Reporters?" "Yes," Zaif admitted. "They think addressing the rumors head-on will put an end to the speculation." He hesitated, his fingers trailing lightly down her arm. "I don't want to force you into anything, Raylan. But if we don't get ahead of this, the tabloids will make up whatever story they want." She swallowed. "And if I don't speak at the press conference? If I choose to stay out of it? Then they'll keep spinning lies about you. About us." His voice was gentle, but the weight of the truth settled between them. "They'll say you're avoiding the public because you have something to hide. That you're ashamed. That I'm ashamed." Raylan bit her lip, her mind racing. She hated the idea of standing in front of cameras, of being judged by strangers who knew nothing about her. But she also hated the thought of the world seeing her as someone who didn't deserve Zaif. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Then I'll do it," she said finally. "I'll stand beside you." Zaif's grip on her tightened for a fraction of a second before he let out a relieved sigh. "You don't have to decide right now," he said, but she could tell by the way his shoulders relaxed that he was grateful. "I've already decided," Raylan murmured. "I don't want to hide." A slow, admiring smile touched his lips. "You're stronger than you think." She wasn't sure if that was true. But for the first time since stepping into Zaif's world, she realized that she wasn't just along for the ride, she was standing her ground. The next morning, preparations for the press conference were in full motion. A stylist arrived at the estate with a selection of elegant yet understated dresses, makeup artists and hair stylists lined up in the hallway, and a speechwriter from Zaif's team handed her a carefully crafted statement. Raylan barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror as the stylist smoothed a final curl into place. She looked polished, poised. Like someone who belonged in this world. Zaif appeared behind her in the reflection, dressed in a sleek black suit. He rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're ready," he murmured. She didn't feel ready. But she nodded anyway. Outside, reporters were already gathering, cameras flashing as they were led to the podium. Zaif's grip on her hand was steady, unwavering. As they stepped into the blinding lights together, Raylan took a deep breath. She wasn't just the unknown bookstore clerk anymore. She was Raylan Howell. And she was ready to tell her story. In the days following the press conference, the world seemed to settle into a new rhythm, a tumultuous blend of public scrutiny and private hope. The media frenzy that had once threatened to unravel their lives slowly began to lose its edge as Zaif and Raylan worked together to control the narrative. Every morning, as sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows of the estate's private wing, Raylan would awake to the quiet reassurance of Zaif's presence beside her. His strong, steady arm around her reminded her that, despite the storm raging outside, their little world was a safe haven built on trust and unwavering commitment. The first few weeks were not without pain. There were moments when Raylan found herself sitting alone in the softly lit drawing room, a cup of tea cooling on the antique table, as she replayed the barrage of questions and invasive interviews in her mind. The press had painted her as everything from a cunning opportunist to a naive girl swept up by a billionaire's charm. At night, when the estate was cloaked in darkness and the only sound was the gentle hum of the wind through the manicured gardens, she would stare at the engagement ring on her finger, a symbol of the love and promise that bound her to Zaif, and wonder if she was strong enough to weather the scrutiny of a world that did not yet know her true self. Zaif, for his part, became her steadfast champion. Every evening after the long, exhausting days filled with meetings and strategy sessions with his legal and public relations teams, he would find Raylan in the quiet corners of the mansion. In those moments, away from the prying eyes of the media and the cold deliberations of corporate boardrooms, he would hold her close and speak in gentle, hushed tones about a future built on shared dreams. He reminded her that their connection was more than the sum of scandalous headlines or the judgments of outsiders. It was a profound promise to be partners in both joy and adversity. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the estate's gardens transformed into a riot of amber and gold leaves, Zaif suggested a walk through the grounds. The walk was meant to be a respite from the chaos of their recent challenges, a moment for them to reclaim a sense of normalcy. They strolled side by side along a winding gravel path, lined with ancient oaks and meticulously trimmed hedges. The air was cool and invigorating, carrying with it the earthy scent of fallen leaves and a hint of impending change. As they passed a quiet pond where ripples danced across the water's surface, Zaif stopped and took Raylan's hand, looking deeply into her eyes. "I know the world out there still judges us," he said softly, "but here, with you, I promise that I will always fight for what we have. I want you to know that my heart has made its choice, and no matter how rough the road ahead, I'm not letting you go." Raylan's gaze searched his, finding in his eyes not just the determination of a man used to navigating corporate battles but also the tenderness of someone who had come to cherish her for who she truly was. "I'm scared, Zaif," she admitted, her voice trembling with both vulnerability and the strength that had grown within her over these turbulent weeks. "I never imagined this life for myself. I never thought I'd be in the center of a storm I can't control." He squeezed her hand gently. "Then let's learn to control the storm together. We have so much to build, so many dreams yet to fulfill." His words wrapped around her like a warm embrace, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Raylan allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the chaos could be turned into something beautiful. As the seasons shifted, the relentless media circus began to wane. The scandal had served its purpose, a dramatic spectacle that eventually faded into the background as the public grew accustomed to the unusual couple at the center of the headlines. Slowly, the focus turned to more personal milestones. In the quiet corridors of the estate, preparations for the arrival of the quintuplets became a source of both joy and nervous anticipation. Doctors and specialists were called in, and Raylan attended regular checkups that filled her calendar with a blend of technical appointments and soft, reassuring moments shared with Zaif. One wintry evening, as snowflakes gently dusted the manicured lawns outside, Raylan sat in a comfortable armchair in the warmth of a crackling fire. Zaif joined her, carrying a tray of hot cocoa, and together they reviewed plans for the nursery that had been transformed into a serene, inviting space for their future children. The room was adorned with gentle pastel colors, soft textiles, and intricate details that spoke of a careful vision for a life of comfort and security. In that moment, as they exchanged quiet smiles and tender words about the future, the trials of the past months melted away, replaced by the steadfast hope of new beginnings. Even the relationship with Aurelia, Zaif's sister, began to find a fragile balance. While she remained vigilant and occasionally sardonic in her assessments, over time her demeanor softened slightly as she witnessed the genuine care Zaif exhibited for Raylan and the children. Small gestures, a supportive word here, a respectful nod there, hinted at an unspoken acknowledgement that the family's unity was paramount. Though the scars of earlier disagreements lingered in the corners of the stately halls, there was also a subtle, cautious reconciliation emerging, as the shared responsibility of the Howell legacy demanded a united front. As spring arrived, with fresh blooms and longer days heralding the promise of renewal, the estate itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The personal triumphs that had once been overshadowed by scandal now took center stage, the birth of the quintuplets was on the horizon, and the couple's commitment to one another was stronger than ever. On a crisp morning, as the first buds of spring unfurled, Zeph and Raylan stood together on the balcony, overlooking the vast estate and the gardens in full bloom. In that quiet, intimate moment, the world outside, its noise, its judgment, its relentless scrutiny, faded into insignificance. Raylan realized that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges she could not yet imagine, but as she looked into Zeph's eyes, filled with a mix of fierce determination and gentle love, she felt an unshakable certainty. The storm they had endured had not broken them, it had forged them into something resilient and enduring. The engagement, the media battles, the internal family strife, they were all chapters in a story that was just beginning. Now, with each new day, they were crafting a life that blended their differences into a shared vision, a life where love and commitment could triumph over adversity. In the soft glow of that spring morning, as the world outside came alive with promise, Raylan whispered a quiet vow to herself. No matter what trials lay ahead, she would embrace the future with courage and grace. With Zeph by her side and a family that, despite its imperfections, was learning to grow stronger together, she felt ready to face the uncertain days. The past had been a tempest, but the future now shone with the gentle light of hope, healing, and the possibility of a love that was as profound as it was transformative.